Many names in this story have been changed to protect the identities of the victims and other innocent parties. On April 4, 1969, 17-year-old Kathy DeFino was doing chores around her house when she got a call from a good friend asking if she wanted to come over. Kathy agreed, and when she finished her work, she said goodbye to her mother and headed out the door. As she was walking down the road in her residential neighborhood, a bright red Corvette pulled up next to her. There were two young men inside, and one of them asked her for directions to Route 8, which runs along the east side of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She was immediately uncomfortable with how close the car pulled up to her, but she gave them directions and continued walking. The car didn't drive away, though. It continued creeping next to her until the driver suddenly stopped and got out. He said something about having a flat tire, but when he got close to Kathy, he lunged forward and grabbed her. Before she knew it, he had his hand over her mouth and the passenger was out of the Corvette helping put her in the vehicle. The driver and passenger switched positions and they took off. The only sign that Kathy had been there was her purse, which she had dropped when the man grabbed her. The man, who was now in the passenger seat, pulled out a gun and put it to Kathy's head. He told her his name was Bill and the driver was Ron. He explained that they had just robbed a bank and needed a hostage. He told Kathy they were going to Ohio. They eventually drove down a gravel road and arrived at a dilapidated house where the man, who called himself Bill, pulled Kathy out of the car and Ron drove off. The man forced Kathy behind the house and instructed her to take her clothes off. Once she had her pants off, Bill used a knife to cut off her underwear, then put them in his pocket. He then raped her while keeping the gun pressed against her temple. By the time Bill was finished, Ron had returned and contemplated taking a turn with Kathy, but decided against it because she was on her period. As they walked around to the front of the house, Kathy mentioned that she had dropped her purse when they abducted her, and that sent Bill into a panic. He told Ron that they needed to kill her, but though Ron was a thief and a potential rapist, it seemed he drew the line at murder. Their plan had been to kidnap and sexually assault Kathy, then drop her off with a warning to not tell anyone what happened, but now Bill was sure that someone had found the purse and had already alerted the police. Their only option was to leave no witnesses. They spent a few minutes talking it over. Bill dead set on killing her, Ron saying they should just let her go, and obviously Kathy agreeing with Ron. Suddenly, headlights appeared on the gravel road and they ran off into the woods behind the house. The house was up in the mountains, and on the other side of the woods was a cliff. It was there that Bill decided he could kill Kathy quietly, sending her body to the river below where it would likely never be found. He forced the teen to the edge of the cliff, and as she begged for her life, she felt his arm come up, and suddenly, she was pulled backwards onto the ground behind her. Her captor smiled and told her he thought she was cool. He said he liked her and he changed his mind. They hopped a fence and walked down the mountain into town. In an alley, they walked up to the Corvette, which Ron must have parked there before walking back to the house. They got in and the two men drove Kathy back to her neighborhood. Bill warned her not to tell anybody what happened or else he would come back and kill her. Kathy promised not to say anything and walked away from the Corvette to her house. Her mother assumed that her daughter had spent the night at her friend's house. Her friend assumed that Kathy had changed her mind about coming over due to the rain. Together they had created excuses for Kathy's absence, meaning nobody had reported her missing. Inside, the house was dark and everyone was asleep. Kathy initially thought that it was best that no one had reported her missing and was going to stay quiet about the attack. The next day, though, she was so on edge that her brother noticed and managed to get the truth out of her. He told their parents and the police were notified about the abduction and sexual assault. Kathy went to the police station to give her statement and she relayed all the details she could remember. She gave them the fake names, descriptions of each of the men, and a description of their vehicle. Then she was taken to the hospital for an examination. The details of the red Corvette matched one that had been used in a robbery a few days before Kathy was attacked. Every officer was made aware to be on the lookout for a matching vehicle, and on the evening of April 6th, Officer Melvin Orris saw a red Corvette with two young men inside drive by as he was parked on the side of the road. When he pulled the car over, the driver handed him a driver's license that said Stanley Hoss. It would be the conclusion of this crime. Stanley would go on to be arrested and convicted of the abduction and rape of Kathy DeFino, but that would end up being the beginning of a crime spree that would include a prison break and multiple deaths, including an infant. This is Monsters. Stanley Barton Hoss Jr. was born on March 1, 1943 to Stanley Sr. and Mary Hoss. He was the middle of 3 children born to the couple, with one older sister, Betty, and one younger brother, Harry. He also had 3 older half-sisters who Mary had had with a previous husband, Mary Jane, and twins, Jenny and Jean. Stan Sr. made a modest living as a coal miner who also collected scrap metal for recycling on the side. Stan Sr. lost his job at the coal mine in the 50s and found a job as a caretaker of the Lakewood Cemetery in Dorseyville, northeast of downtown Pittsburgh. That was a position where they lived in a house on the property. The family were loyal members of the local Methodist church, and the girls were known to be good students. Stanley would not fare as well, having had to repeat the 1st grade and then the 4th. His mother would blame his troubles in school and then his crimes later in life on a head injury he suffered when he fell out of a tree at the age of 5 or 6. She said, quote, "Hit his head pretty good, but his dad wouldn't take him to the hospital because we couldn't afford it." On top of that, Stanley was hospitalized with a kidney infection at 9. He was hospitalized again at 12 with a liver condition. When he was 17, he was in a car accident where he fractured his skull and injured his cervical vertebrae. Despite his frequent ailments, Stanley was not considered weak in school. His teachers remembered him as being quiet, but other classmates admitted that he would occasionally take other students' lunch money. By 14, Stanley was committing more serious crimes by raiding homes of valuables he could sell. When he was 16, he was 2 years behind the other students his age, and school administrators encouraged him to drop out. Their belief was that he would be better suited to just learn a trade, as school clearly wasn't for him. Stanley agreed and left school. The previous summer, Stanley had met Diane, and in October of 1959, when she was 15 years old, not long after Stanley dropped out of school, they got married at the local magistrate's office. They lived with the Hosses at the cemetery for a year before they all moved to a farm. The 4 eldest daughters had all married and moved out, so it was just Stan Sr., Mary, Stanley, Diane, and Harry. It was there that Diane had their first son, Stanley Hos III, and would go on to have another child every few years for a total of 4. Those children came between times when Stanley was in jail for one or another petty crime. Stealing and chopping cars was at the top of the list for him as far as making money illegally. Stanley and Diane's relationship was not healthy, and though they remained married until after Stanley's crime spree, he moved on to a woman named Jodine. In the late 60s, Stanley and Jodine would have 2 children together, both sons. The first they called Stanley Hoss Jr., like Stanley's father and other son didn't exist. It was while Jodine was pregnant with their second son that Stanley committed the crimes that would get him sent to prison for much more considerable time than he had previously been. At the end of March of 1969, Nancy Falconer was at home in the morning with her husband Dennis and young son. Dennis got ready for work and left the house at 8:15, and shortly after, a bright red Corvette pulled up outside her house. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door, and when she opened it, there were 2 men, one with a stocking over his head and the other in a ski mask. She described one being huskier, more muscular, and the other more slim. They forced their way in, and Nancy lied, saying her husband had only gone out for diapers and would be back soon. The huskier one said he knew she was lying and slapped her in the face. She still had a red welt when the police arrived later to take her statement. They stole some valuables, a handful of firearms, and her car, and she believed they would have sexually assaulted her if she hadn't been heavily pregnant. A few days later, the Falconer's car, a yellow 1967 Mercury station wagon, was found abandoned in a Pittsburgh suburb. There was no evidence in the car that would point authorities to the robbers, but a week later, Kathy DeFino reported being kidnapped and sexually assaulted by two men in a red Corvette, and police suspected they were the same two men who had robbed the Falconers. On Sunday, April 6th, Officer Orris pulled over a red Corvette being driven by Stanley Hoss, who had called himself Bill during Kathy's abduction. In the passenger seat was Richard Zerka, the man who she had known as Ron. Stanley handed over his driver's license but said he couldn't find the registration, most likely not wanting to reveal that the car was not his. Because of that, the officer instructed Stanley to follow him back to the police station. Back in the 1960s and 70s, police work was a little more loosey-goosey than it is today. Despite having the ability to flee in a vehicle that could likely outperform the patrol car, Stanley did as he was told. He and Richard walked into the police station and sat down while the officer went into an office to call Kathy and ask her to come down to view a lineup. When Orris went back into the reception area, Richard was gone and the desk sergeant was wide-eyed. It turned out that Stanley had pulled out a gun, handed it to Richard, and told him to get out of there. Richard took off in the Corvette and the desk sergeant was just relieved he hadn't been shot. When Officer Orris asked Stanley about the gun, the perp responded, quote, "What gun?" Orris knew he had screwed up, but at least Kathy was able to come to the station and quickly picked Stanley out of a lineup. Officer Orris would later say that from that point on he frisked anyone that even gave him the slightest reason to. Stanley was taken to an interrogation room and questioned about a number of crimes he had been suspected of. He denied any knowledge of them and claimed that Kathy was lying about the rape. Of course, back then there was no physical evidence of a rape to go on, so it was he said, she said, but one officer noticed that the coat Stanley was wearing seemed familiar. It turned out that one of the items that had been stolen from the Falconers had been one of Dennis's coats. Nancy gave the police a detailed description and even told them that she had hemmed the sleeves, which she had done with green thread. When investigators took a closer look at the coat he was wearing, they noticed the sleeves had been hemmed with green thread, and they called Nancy down to do a voice comparison. Stanley had worn a mask while committing the crime, but Nancy told the police that one of them had a distinct voice she thought she would remember. She listened to 5 men's voices and had no problem picking Stanley out. Once they had confirmed that Stanley had committed another crime in the same vehicle, the police were more inclined to believe Kathy, and Stanley was arrested for rape and robbery. While Stanley sat in jail, waiting for the court system to make a decision about his crimes, he was able to get word out to some friends who began harassing the DeFino family. They received threatening phone calls and their home was vandalized, which only added to Kathy's shame. Unfortunately, the people who were supposed to take care of her after she was sexually assaulted caused her even more trauma. A father who didn't believe her, a doctor who dismissed her like a problem instead of treating her like a patient. Her extended family blamed her for causing her home to become a target instead of focusing their anger on the person who had kidnapped and raped her. Still, she gathered her strength and testified in front of a grand jury, knowing that Stanley Hoss was the one responsible for everything that had happened to her. After hours of testimony, being questioned more about what her actions were during the rape, with details like if she had been a virgin and did she remove her own clothes, like that mattered, Kathy was informed that the grand jury had handed down an indictment against Stanley Hoss. Not long after that, Richard Zerka was apprehended and both the criminals were indicted for the robbery of the Falconers. Richard would end up being tried separately for his involvement in the abduction of Kathy DeFino. Stanley's rape trial happened on July 8th and was not heard by a jury. His fate would be decided by a single judge, and after hearing Kathy's testimony and viewing the evidence, including the pants that she had been wearing which were still covered in dried mud from the evening, he found Stanley Hoss guilty of 1 count of rape. While awaiting his sentencing hearing, Stanley was returned to the local jail, but it was overcrowded, so about 300 inmates were sent up to the Allegheny Workhouse, which was about 9 miles or 14 kilometers up the Allegheny River from Pittsburgh. The complex included 700 acres of farmland where nonviolent offenders would work the fields. There were a number of other industries inside where violent offenders were put to work manufacturing textiles, furniture, and tools. Stanley was first assigned to the textile shop, but the foreman noticed that he caused problems, so he kicked him out of the shop. After Stanley befriended another inmate named Thomas Labreski, Thomas talked his foreman at the maintenance shop into bringing him on board. That opportunity worked out better for Stanley because it provided him more tools to put his escape plan into motion. He needed to break out of prison before he was sentenced, because once that happened, he'd be transferred to Western Penitentiary, which he would not be able to escape from. In August, Stanley brought his plan up to Thomas, who was all in, and they quickly got ready to break free from the workhouse. On September 11, 1969, while news of the Manson family murders were still fresh in everyone's minds, Stanley and Thomas had managed to saw through a metal bar and break the glass of a skylight, allowing them to get onto the roof of the building. Then they used a bed sheet to drop to the ground and run to the nearby river. It was only 20 minutes later that the guards noticed that they were missing and then found the broken skylight. While lying on the riverbank catching their breath, they could hear the sirens at the prison wailing in the crisp night air. With the siren bringing more people outside, the escapees stayed along the river's edge as they ran out of the area. After 30 minutes, they could still see flashlights bobbing behind them, so they took a chance and headed away from the river, hoping to find a car to steal. The men lucked out when they found a '63 Chevy sitting outside of a house that was all dark. They hopped in, fired it up, and drove away before the owner was able to intervene. Stanley was not interested in a partnership outside of breaking out of the workhouse, so he drove to an area nearby where Thomas's girlfriend lived and dropped him off. That was the last time the inmates would see each other. For days following the escape, police watched places that either of the fugitives might return to. For Stanley, they posted up outside Diane's house, as they were still married despite Stanley having children with another woman. They also kept an eye on the DeFino house in case Stanley made good on his threat to kill Kathy if she reported the rape to the police. Stanley had a very close relationship with his older full sister, Betty. It was so close that almost everyone who was later interviewed about them would say they suspected their relationship may have been incestuous. It was only speculated because everyone felt they behaved a little too close from time to time. Police interviewed Betty, who claimed she had not seen or heard from her brother, but officers believed she was lying. If they were right, she was unwilling to rat on Stanley. Not everyone was that loyal, though, since a few days after the escape, an anonymous call was made to the police station to report that Stanley was at an old farm in Fawn Township, just north of where he used to live with Diane. As they approached the shack that the owner of the property was living in, they saw him with Stanley and a woman. Stanley took off into the woods, and though the officers gave chase, they lost him. By the time they returned to the shack, the woman was gone. The owner confirmed that it was Stanley, and the woman was Jodine, who had just had their second son and was bringing Stanley food. She slipped away when the officers were going after the fugitive. For someone who had successfully escaped prison, Stanley stayed unusually close to the workhouse. The farm was only about 15 miles or 24 kilometers north of the workhouse, and even when Stanley went farther than that, he always came back. About 4 days after fleeing from the police at the farm, a woman had her yellow 1964 Chevy Impala convertible stolen from outside a diner in Boston Heights, Ohio, about 110 miles or 170 kilometers northwest of Pittsburgh. The day after the car was stolen, Stanley went back towards the workhouse and ended up in the small city of Verona. Verona was just over the Allegheny River from the workhouse to the east and was a blue-collar area with a small police force where many people worked in the local mills. The newest addition to that force was Joseph Sanella, who went by Joe. Joe was born on February 24, 1944, sharing a birthday with yours truly, and after a brief stint in the Vietnam War for the U.S. Army, he was offered a position on the police force. He remained in the Army Reserves and was a volunteer firefighter with a wife and 2 young children. On September 19th, Joe started his shift at 4 p.m. and his first task was to escort the local tax collector to the bank. At about 4:15, Fred Mangle, the manager of a local drive-thru restaurant, saw Stanley at the walk-up counter ordering a cup of coffee. They had gone to high school together, and Fred knew that Stanley was a wanted man. He watched as the fugitive hopped into a yellow Impala and drove away, wrote down the license plate number, and called the police. Joe got the call on his radio at 4:36 p.m., not long after dropping the tax collector off at her car. It's believed that Stanley was intending to visit Jodine, which meant he needed to drive through Verona. He was quickly spotted by Joe, who turned his cruiser onto the road behind him. Joe radioed for backup, and being the only officer on duty in Verona, officers from the neighboring city had to be notified. The desk sergeant there received the request for backup, but waited until officers finished a meeting before passing on the information. Once he had called for backup, Joe flipped on his lights, intending to pull the vehicle over, but Stanley had no intention of stopping. He hit the gas and Joe pursued. Joe was able to catch up to Stanley and tried to force his car to the side of the road. Stanley quickly turned onto Plum Street, where he could have accelerated and tried to escape, but he hit the brakes and stopped. Joe got out of his patrol car and approached the Chevy with his service weapon drawn. As he got a few steps closer to the vehicle, he called out for the driver to get out of the car with his hands up. It was then that Stanley leaned out of the window and fired 2 shots from a J.C. Higgins .22 caliber revolver toward the officer. One bullet missed and the other hit Joe in the chest. Joe fell to the ground and the yellow Impala sped away. Unfortunately, back then, communications abilities were not great, so once reports of the shooting came out, there was a lot of confusion. Joe was eventually rushed to the hospital, and officers from all over the area set up roadblocks and hunted down the fugitive. When news hit the radio that Joe had died, the hunt was on for a cop killer. Stanley had managed to evade the officers for a while, but the bright yellow convertible was too distinct and he was eventually spotted. As 2 patrol cars were turning around to pursue him, Stanley turned onto a farm road and down a hill, hidden from sight. The police cars raced by on the highway as Stanley drove deeper into the farmland. When the road ended, he abandoned the car and ran through the woods toward an old mining town called Barking. As Stanley made it to the mine, the workers were just ending their shift and were completely unaware of the recent criminal activity in their area. The fugitive was able to hitch a ride north with one of the workers, who assumed he was just a lonely traveler. They made their way up the highway, and when they came to a roadblock, the officers saw the men, both dirty, with a hard hat and a lunchbox in the truck with them, and assumed they were both miners. They were waved through, and Stanley was soon in New Kensington. There, Stanley stole a green 1956 Pontiac and drove off. That vehicle was found the next day in Lower Burrell, the neighboring city to New Kensington. By the next day, Stanley had stolen another vehicle and pulled it into a cemetery where he slept. When he woke up, he wandered around the cemetery until he saw 20-year-old Karen Maxwell praying at her father's grave. On the road next to her was a 1968 Dodge, and Stanley thought it would make the perfect getaway vehicle. He approached Karen and ordered her to get in the car at gunpoint. He told her to get in the driver's seat, and he got into the passenger seat. He made her drive east for hours before stopping at a payphone to have her call her mother and make up a story about why she had never returned home. Karen told Stanley that her mother believed the story, but she hadn't. Her mother reported the call to the police, but since Karen was an adult, they didn't take action. After the phone call, they started driving southwest towards Kentucky, but would end up driving aimlessly for most of the trip. After about 18 hours of driving, Stanley ordered Karen to pull off the road into a cornfield where he raped her at gunpoint. He then ordered her to redress and they continued driving. He promised to let her go in multiple cities, but then ordered her to keep driving. She had not slept and finally made the decision to refuse to continue. She exited the highway, pulled into the parking lot of a local hospital, and told Stanley she was done. She expected the man to kill her, but he just opened the door and got out. He told her to wait to go to the cops and walked away. She drove away and found a highway patrol station where she reported the crime. She was in Wheeling, West Virginia, and since the kidnapping had crossed state lines, the FBI became involved in the case. Stanley had used the hospital parking lot to take his pick of cars to steal. He ended up in a white 1964 Chevy Impala. Local authorities were on the lookout, but Stanley was already headed east to Maryland. Linda Stewart was born on March 28, 1948 in Westernport, Maryland. Despite her parents getting divorced when she was 5, her mother remarried a railroad foreman and they moved to Bel Air, northeast of Baltimore. She was said to have a pretty typical upbringing and did well in school, being the valedictorian of her graduating class. After high school, Linda met a man named Gerald Pujo and fell in love, but she had met him on vacation and he was a steel worker in Pennsylvania. After a few more visits and meeting each other's parents, the couple got married and Linda moved in with him in Beaver, Pennsylvania. On September 23, 1967, they had their only child, a daughter named Lori Mae. About a year and a half later, as the Vietnam War was raging, Gerald, who had been in the Navy Reserves, was called to active duty. He was stationed in Jacksonville, Florida, and at first they all moved down together, but since Gerald was going to be at sea for months at a time, they decided it would make more sense for Linda and Lori to stay with Linda's mother, who was living in Western Maryland by then. Once there, Linda got a job as a waitress at a local restaurant, and they settled in to wait for Gerald to finish his service. On September 22nd, Linda put Lori Mae into her green 1964 GTO and planned to run some errands. The following day was her daughter's second birthday, and she had to pick up supplies for the party. She stopped by the bank to cash a check and then headed to the neighboring city of LaVale to do her shopping. The car Stanley stole from the hospital parking lot only had about a quarter of a tank of gas. He didn't have any money, so he would need to ditch the car and find something else. He cut across the southwest corner of Pennsylvania, and by the time he entered Maryland, the tank was on E. It was in LaVale that he saw the parking lot of a large department store and knew it was the perfect spot to find another car. He sat in the Impala and watched as Linda pulled her GTO into the parking lot and walked into the store with Lori Mae at her side. Inside the store, Linda made her purchases, and about 45 minutes later she walked out into the parking lot. Stanley got out of the stolen Impala and paced himself to get to Linda right as she got to her car. He suddenly approached her and told her not to make a sound or else he would blow her head off. Other people in the parking lot say they saw the interaction, at first only looking like a couple talking, but soon it seemed like an argument and then they got into the GTO. Linda started the car and they drove out of the parking lot. Not wanting to be in the same position as with the last car, Stanley made Linda stop at a gas station and have the attendant fill the tank. Linda Pujo would never be seen again. Lori Mae was seen a few more times by various people throughout Ohio. A couple of motel desk clerks, a few waitresses, and a man who saw the girl crying in a car while Stanley was in a bar drinking a beer. Unfortunately, he didn't call the authorities and just went into the bar to let Stanley know about the situation. Authorities realized that Stanley's weakness was Jodine. He had stopped at a florist and had a dozen roses sent to her home. Then he found 2 postcards in the glove box of the GTO and sent them to Jodine with love notes on them. The FBI were able to stay close on his tail because of that, but unfortunately they wouldn't get him in time. Stanley continually claimed he was going to go to Canada, but he drove west. He had a pattern of robbing a gas station, then finding a small motel to sleep at. He made it as far west as Nebraska before heading north into South Dakota. Once in South Dakota, though, he turned again and began driving east. It seemed that he couldn't force himself to stay away from the Pittsburgh area. By the time he hit Sioux Falls, Lori Mae was no longer with him. He had traveled for days with the 2-year-old, likely using her presence to lower people's guards. But somewhere in the rural Midwest, Stanley made the young girl disappear. While at a motel in Jackson, Minnesota, he called Jodene's brother-in-law and gave him a number to pass to Jodene. He did have the ability to call Jodene, but he probably assumed her phone line was being traced, which it was. The number he had given didn't work, but when the agent interviewed Jodene, she explained that it was actually a code and the message said he loved her and he was coming home. They traced the call to a payphone outside the Skyline Motel, but by the time Jackson police officers arrived, Stanley was gone. The only problem was that Stanley was unaware that his secret code to Jodene had been cracked and the authorities knew he was headed to Philly. They were able to narrow their search to that path and catch up to him pretty quickly. The following day, Stanley checked into a motel in Waterloo, Iowa, and believing he was in the clear from being spotted, he went into the city and stopped at a cafe for an early dinner. While Stanley normally always kept his gun on him, he would have to wear his jacket to hide it and he didn't want to in the cafe, so he left the revolver in the car. As Stanley was inside eating a steak, a local police sergeant was just about to finish his shift when he saw the GTO in the parking lot of the cafe. It's possible that Stanley hadn't realized it was there, but it's also possible that he was so sure he had evaded law enforcement that he was being bold enough to be eating in a cafe across the street from the police station. The sergeant went inside and gathered back up before returning to the restaurant. A few plainclothes detectives sat down in the cafe pretending to be customers, and when Stanley finished his meal and left, they were right behind him. Other officers had surrounded the building, and since Stanley had left his gun in the car, he believed he had no other option but to fight. As the detectives grabbed him and asked for ID, Stanley began throwing fists and elbows. He had managed to hold his own against 3 detectives, but soon uniformed officers rushed in, one with a spray of mace to Stanley's eyes, and they eventually got him on the ground and cuffed. Stanley wouldn't say anything to the authorities, but when he was searched, they found a key to room 7 at the Travelers Motel, and officers raced there, hoping they would be rescuing Linda and Laura May. But to their dismay, the room was empty. In the room, they did find a hit list that Stanley had written that had the names of multiple police officers he had encountered in his past. The jail that Stanley was taken to was only a few years old and was technologically advanced for the time. He was stripped naked and placed in a cell that was inside another cell on the 4th floor of the building. All of his bedding was removed from the cell before he arrived. He would not be escaping this time. In an interrogation room on the same secure floor as the cell, investigators' main focus was on finding Linda and Lori May. Stanley played dumb, claiming he had no idea who they were talking about. After a few days, Stanley agreed to talk, but not about everything. He confessed to breaking out, but refused to talk about the shooting of Officer Joe Zanella. He claimed that Karen Maxwell met him at the cemetery and they went on a trip together, as if Karen was a willing participant. He claimed he dropped her off and then she made up the story about him kidnapping her. He admitted to driving another stolen car to the shopping center in La Vale, but he continued to deny knowing who Linda or Lori May were. Stanley asked for coffee, and in an effort to keep him talking, authorities got it for him. Then he stalled again by asking to call his mother, who had been admitted to the hospital for a mild heart attack, and of course, he wanted to call Jodene. The detective said no. He told Stanley he would only let him make the calls if he told him the truth. So the outlaw gave in and explained what had happened in the parking lot that day. He told them how he forced Linda to drive him out of the area with Lori May in the back seat. He said that, somewhere in Pennsylvania, Linda pulled over and refused to continue. She was trying to get out of the car when Stanley shot her multiple times. Then he stuffed her body in the trunk and continued driving himself. He eventually dumped her body in a field. After being pushed more by investigators, Stanley admitted to keeping the baby around for a week and then killing her. He told the detectives that he put his hand over her mouth and smothered her. Then he put her body in a box and fired 9 rounds into the box. When a detective asked if the bullets hit the box, Stanley responded, quote, "Every one." He claimed he put the box in a dump near Kansas City. Neither body has ever been recovered. Stanley was returned to Pennsylvania, where he was first sentenced for his original conviction, the rape of Kathy DeFino. The judge sentenced him to 10 to 20 years in prison. Then he went on trial for the murder of Officer Joe Zanella. He had finally confessed to the crime while in FBI custody, but in court he pleaded not guilty. With a trial ahead, the prosecutor decided to seek the death penalty. The federal prosecutor tried to offer Stanley a deal to have the death penalty removed if he took them to Linda and Lori Mae's bodies, but the Allegheny County prosecutor shut it down. At trial, the gun found with Stanley when he was arrested was linked to the shooting, and there were multiple witnesses who identified the fugitive as the shooter. Karen Maxwell testified about being kidnapped by Stanley and how he told her about shooting a cop in order to make sure she knew he was serious. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found Stanley Hoss guilty of first-degree murder. The following day, the penalty phase got underway to decide if Stanley would spend the rest of his life in prison or if he would be put to death. After only an hour, the jury chose death. Stanley was condemned to death for his crimes, but he would ensure that he didn't leave the world without taking one more life. Stanley was on death row at Western Penitentiary in Pittsburgh, which meant he was in solitary for 23.5 hours a day. He didn't have the ability to escape or form any relationships with other inmates. Of course, Stanley still wanted to escape, and he believed his only chance would be when transported to Maryland to stand trial for the murders of Linda and Lori Mae Pujo. He pushed his lawyers to get the trial started immediately so he would have a chance at freedom by breaking out of some small local jail, but they were only interested in doing their jobs properly and took their time to mount a serious defense. Also, the prosecution wanted to wait as long as they could to hopefully find some evidence of Linda and Lori Mae's death outside of blood inside the trunk of her car. That changed in 1971 when the governor of Pennsylvania lifted the order to have all prisoners condemned to death stay in solitary confinement. On February 21, 1971, Stanley Hoss was transferred to the general population and he began working in a shop making license plates. In October, Stanley's lawyers succeeded in getting his death sentence overturned. Because testimony of his kidnap and murder of Linda and Lori Mae was given at his sentencing hearing, a crime he had not even been charged with at the time as opposed to convicted, the Supreme Court vacated his death sentence. They gave him a life sentence without parole. In another blow to Stanley's victims, in late 1972, the Supreme Court of Maryland ruled that Stanley's right to a speedy trial had been violated and the charges against him in Maryland be dropped. That didn't mean that Stanley couldn't be tried for the kidnapping of Linda and Lori Mae, though. The state had dropped the charges, but the federal government could have still prosecuted him. They didn't, though. They decided to not get any justice for the Pujos. Before we reach the exciting conclusion of this episode, I just want to remind you that we're trying to hit 1 million subscribers this year, so before you go, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Even better, tell someone else about the channel so they could subscribe too. Then make sure you both turn on notifications so you always know when a new episode airs. You can also support the channel by checking out our merch at thisismonsters.com. A link is in the description. Your support is appreciated, and be kind to each other. It might not come as any surprise that Stanley Hoss was a racist. Even though he had almost no regard for any life, he had an especially deep hatred of other races. That was proven when he stabbed a black inmate in August of 1972, but he would take it up a level at the end of 1973. Stanley and a few other inmates decided they were going to commit a murder, but thought killing another inmate was too quote-unquote small fry. They wanted to murder a black person, and so they chose Lieutenant Walter Peterson, one of the few black prison guards. On December 10th, Stanley and the other inmates lured Walter to the area and began beating him. One inmate used a bed sheet to tie the inner doors of the two-door setup closed, buying them more time with their victim. Once the guard was on the ground for good, Stanley and the other inmates started slicing his throat with makeshift razors. That wasn't enough for the racist inmates, though. Once they believed he was dead, they threw a jacket over his head and began stomping it. Then, in one final act of disrespect, they urinated on the dead man's body. Stanley had thoroughly proven that he was evil beyond anything the authorities had ever seen. He had killed anyone from a baby to a prison guard. while free and while in prison. There was no redemption for Stanley, and his original death sentence would have been more appropriate than the life sentence he had. As long as Stanley Hoss was alive, nobody was safe. But he would still not be executed by the state. By the time of Lieutenant Peterson's murder, the governor of Pennsylvania had put an end to the death penalty in the state. Stanley was put on trial for murder, found guilty of second-degree murder, and sentenced to an additional life term without parole. It seemed that, despite the evidence that showed Stanley and the other inmates planned out the murder ahead of time, the jury believed it was a spur-of-the-moment act. For someone like Stanley, who wanted to find any way to get out of prison, murdering a guard did not do him any favors. He spent the next few years filing appeals trying to get other sentences overturned like his death sentence was, but by 1978, most of his hope was lost. His chances of ever seeing the outside world had diminished, and he decided to end things himself. After losing all his appeals, having Diane and Jodine leave him, and his sister Betty dying of cancer, Stanley decided it was his time to die. On December 6, 1978, he used a shoestring and some denim to make a noose and hung himself in his cell. He had managed to steal a little bit of paint and use it to write a message on the wall of his cell. It read, quote, "I cannot deny this urge to die, to put an end to what has been this agony called life." He took the location of Linda and Lori Mae's remains with him to the grave. Seldom has there been a person who can be categorized as such an unfeeling predator as Stanley Hoss. To have no issue with killing anyone in your way to what you want is remarkable when it comes to serial offenders. Serial killers have a need to kill, but not Stanley. He could have gone his whole life without killing anyone, but he was so selfish that he took multiple lives in order to get his way. Money, a car, freedom, a reputation. Those things were worth the life of a police officer, a prison guard, and even a mother and her 2-year-old daughter. Despite the fact that the monster was already locked in a cage, when Stanley took his own life, the world still became a safer place. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.